He called her dead weight, and the word kept ringing in the courtroom. But Abini's hands, though trembling, did not belong to a woman breaking. They belonged to a woman arriving. The high court smelled of varnish and old files. Fans carved slow circles while lawyers shuffled bundles, and the clerk lowered her eyes at anyone bold enough to raise a phone. Musa lounged 3 chairs away in a suit the color of certainty, chin tipped up, sunglasses nesting in his hair as if the room were his. He tapped a pen, 2 quick knocks, his usual rhythm, then leaned toward his counsel with a smirk that said the story was already written. Judge Okoye entered, and the room rose like a tide. Their case number clicked into place. Musa's smile widened. "We are here to sign the decree," his lawyer began, voice warm with practiced economy. "Mutual consent, no contested claims." Musa's pen hovered. He turned a fraction toward Abini and, with a private grin, murmured, "At last, free of your dead weight." The phrase struck like a dropped plate, sharp. Yet Abini only exhaled, a tiny sail adjusting to wind. Her ring lay in a velvet pouch within her bag. Her spine arranged itself, one vertebra at a time. Then the judge lifted a page, peered over his glasses, and said, "Before this court proceeds, there is one financial disclosure to be entered into the record." Paper rasped. Tabs gleamed. The clerk advanced with a hardbound file whose spine bore 3 letters that had lived in the dark for 18 months. A.B.N. Musa's pen paused above the line. The judge opened to the first section. Registration certifications, tax IDs, trademark pages, stamped and clean. His finger rode the margins while he read out dates. A small murmur traveled the benches. The second section came open. Bank attestations, fulfillment contracts, supplier terms, and the judge's tone altered by a degree, barely perceptible except for a woman who had learned to hear fractions. Abini felt the room tilt toward truth. She did not glance at Musa. She watched the numbers take their seats. The third section unfolded with an elegance she had earned. Purchase orders from regional buyers, a signed term sheet with modest dilution, clean books audited by a firm that valued commas more than talk. Then the letter, its logo quiet but authoritative, an independent valuation placing ABN Studio at $18 million last quarter. The word million did not boom. It landed. Benches stopped creaking. Someone's bracelet went still. Musa removed his sunglasses as if better light might fix the arithmetic. He leaned forward, lips forming the acronym like a question he once heard and forgot to ask. The clerk passed copies. Abini's lawyer, calm as a metronome, slid a summary sheet to the bench and said, "Ownership, sold. Revenues, attached. Partners, enumerated." The judge nodded, made 3 notes deliberately, and spoke the line that fractured the script Musa had rehearsed. "Assets recognized and entered. This court acknowledges Miss Adeyemi's proprietorship of ABN Studio and the records before us." The sentence was not dramatic. It was a door unlocking in daylight. Musa's shoulders lost a centimeter. His pen, finally lowering, clicked against the table in a small apology. Abini's trembling settled into stillness, a lake at dawn. She thought of the lopsided desk, the midnight lists, the first soft ping of an order at 3:22 a.m., the way her alias had felt like armor and then like skin. She thought of bracelets exchanged for rent and of cloth cut on a floor cleared of shame. When the judge asked if she wished to make any statement, she said, "No, your lordship, the record is sufficient." Musa turned, searching her face for anger or triumph, anything he understood. He found only peace. Unnerving as a mirror returned truth. Outside, a generator coughed. Inside, the clock hands moved without permission. The decree would be finalized, yes, but not in the story he had sold to himself. It will be set in the ledger where effort converts to equity and silence to power. In that room of wood and waiting, the bell finally stopped ringing, not because the insult was forgiven, but because it had been outlived. In the beginning, there were thin walls and thick dreams, and the beanie learned how to stack one against the other so life didn't cave in. She was 22, newly in love, and believed that partnership was a verb you conjugated with both hands, so she woke before dawn to iron Moose's shirts on a board that wobbled like a foal, packed his pitch notes beside her own bank reports, and memorized the bus timetable so neither of them would be late for the versions of themselves they were trying to become. When rent ran short, she unclasped the bracelets her mother had given her, delicate loops that sang softly when she moved, and traded them for a receipt. Then came home smiling so he wouldn't hear the clink of sacrifice. Evening, she cooked in a kitchen that steamed the windows opaque, tasting stew with the same care she used proofreading his investor emails. And at night, she spread her sketchbooks across the bed, color stories, sleeve experiments, hems cut like size, before folding them away when Musa announced he had one last algorithm tweak and needed the space. During those first hungry years, he spoke of launches the way sailors speak of land, voice bright and far off, and she cheered from the shoreline, sending messages into the dark. You've got this. I'm proud. Try slide 4 with fewer words. When the app finally caught like dry tinder, one article, then another, then metrics rising like a tide, people came with microphones and sleek shoes, and rooms opened for him that had once kept both of them outside. She watched without envy and with a careful kind of joy, the kind that doesn't demand credit because it knows the work by heart. Yet slowly, those rooms that widened for Musa narrowed around her, and introductions softened from "my wife" to "she helps around," and laughter found her as punchline more often than his partner. Still, she adjusted, the way a tailor nips a seam to make a dress fall better, and told herself that smallness next to someone else's spotlight isn't the same as being small. But the evidence gathered. The way he walked ahead of her at conferences, as if the distance were a uniform. The way we in private became I in public. The way he saved his softest voice for strangers. She said little and counted everything. Who turned their backs, which favors came with invisible invoices. How success taught even kind people to mispronounce gratitude. And in counting, she discovered a quiet muscle she hadn't named, a steadiness that outlasted hurt. There were nights she tried to speak and found the words wore shoes too heavy for the hallway. So instead, she wrapped her silence in usefulness, brought water, booked cabs, tracked deliverables, and held her tongue when the world held the microphone too close to his mouth. The first time he joked to friends that love had phases, she stared at the condensation ring her glass left on the table and turned it with a finger until the circle disappeared. The second time he called her a phase, he did it in a room perfumed with approval, and the laughter peeled through her like citrus, but she did not peel back. She watched the joke set like varnish on the surface of people she would no longer try to impress. At home, she opened the drawer where her sketches slept and ran a thumb along the graphite. Muscle memory fluttered, then lay down again, because dreams can hibernate without dying. On Sundays, when the city slowed to listen to itself, she walked the market aisles, touching fabrics she could name with her eyes closed. Ankara that flirted with the light, Aso-oke that carried entire genealogies in its gleam, and whispered color recipes under her breath, a chemist without a lab. When Mosa began the podcast, his voice fat with certainty, she sat just off camera, scrolling nothing, collecting each line he tossed into the world about so-called female founders and tucking it beside the bracelets in her memory box. She kept loving him, but she also started loving the version of herself who could endure this chapter without losing the plot. And that love was different, less service, more stewardship. She learned that faith, unguided, bleeds into erasure. So she set small boundaries with no speeches. She stopped explaining where she put the scissors. She stopped apologizing for being quiet in noisy rooms. She stopped pretending she didn't know the cost of applause. In bed, while Mosa drafted keynote anecdotes, She traced invisible pattern pieces on the ceiling, aligning darts and facings no one else could see, and thought about how garments are birthed in silence, measured, cut, stitched, pressed, revealed. If a life could be tailored, she would begin again from the inside, reinforce the seams time had stressed, and fit it, finally, to her own deliberate.
The room was lacquered with triumph. Low amber lights, glassware chiming like agreeable bells, and conversations stitched with acronyms that tried to sound like destiny. And Benny, carrying a tray of puff-puff and suya skewers, because habit is a hard seam to unpick, drifted between clusters of people who had learned to look past the woman who steadied the ladder. Musa anchored the brightest corner, laughter turned up to camera ready, and when a venture bro asked about the early days, he stretched the story like taffy until her part snapped clean off. Then, performers pause, audience primed, said, "A Benny?" She was just a phase. And the circle detonated with polite cruelty, that soft, eager laughter people use to prove they belong. She didn't drop the tray. She didn't even blink. She placed it on the credenza with the delicacy she saved for bias cuts, then walked to the balcony where Lagos laid out its private constellations, Okada's braiding light, generators coughing, the lagoon keeping its secrets. She gripped the rail until the night steadied. If pain was a blade, she refused to hand it a handle. Through the glass, she could still see Moose's mouth forming success into first-person singular. Could see hands clap for the edited version of a climb two people made with one rope. She breathed the way Madame Teo had taught her, 4 in, 6 out, and named the facts, not the feelings. He thinks performance is proof. They think the punchline is harmless. I have mistaken endurance for partnership. Inside, someone called her, "Hey, can you?" And she turned with a smile that didn't travel to her eyes and said, "One moment." Then let the moment grow tall enough to block that door forever. She drifted past compliments meant for Moose's echo and found the powder room, where the mirror, bright as an interrogation, offered her the same face she'd been rescuing all year. Highbrow, steady mouth, the seam of resolve pressed sharp as a crease. She fixed her head tie, wiped an invisible smudge from her cheek, and remembered the bracelets she'd traded for rent, the stew she stirred while editing his pitch decks, the nights she folded her sketches so his laptop could sprawl. The arithmetic no longer balanced. When she stepped back into the party, the DJ had found a tempo that asked for knees and abandon. She offered neither, collected her bag from under a chair, and told the hostess, "Thank you for having us." If anyone noticed she left alone, they didn't say. Outside, the air tasted like wet iron. She booked a ride and watched the map draw a thin blue thread home. The driver's radio murmured a talk show about high-value choices, and she smiled at the universe's timing without humor. In the elevator, she read the building's fire escape diagram and thought, not for the first time, about how every space that welcomes you also marks the nearest exit. The apartment opened like a held breath released. She set her bag down, washed her hands until the party was gone, and made tea she didn't drink. On the couch, Moose's jacket sprawled, expensive and careless. It smelled like oak moss and applause. She hung it not as service, but as ritual closure, then tidied a coffee ring with a cloth, the way you erase a circle someone used to trap you. When the lock clicked an hour later, and Musa rolled in with the swept-back glow of a hero surviving his own narrative, she greeted him without accusation. "Welcome." And he kissed the air near her temple, already halfway to recounting a joke she had heard through glass. He showered, sang a chorus that rhymed hustle with muscle, and fell asleep sprawled diagonally across the bed, exhaustion his alibi. The night went thin again. Benny stood in the corridor, feeling her life like a garment that had been sized for someone else's ease. She walked to the small room, dusty, faithful, waiting, and opened the window to let the city's hum mix with her pulse. She did not sit at the desk yet. She simply stood, hand on the sleeping laptop, as if greeting a friend at a door before inviting her in. On the shelf, her old sketchbooks held their breath. She chose one and flipped to a page where she'd once written in the margin, "Measure twice, cut once. Cut once, move forward." The pencil lines looked back, confident, unashamed. Somewhere down the hall, Moose's phone vibrated and stilled, a small animal dreaming. Somewhere in her chest, a decision clicked into place with the quiet finality of a well-made button. She wouldn't fight for place in rooms that required her erasure as ticket. She would build a different room. She would fill it with work that did not need her apology to exist. She closed the sketchbook, set it square on the desk, and turned off the lights. Tomorrow would be ordinary to anyone watching. Bank shift, market stop, a nod to the security man. But tonight, on the balcony of the loud and in the corridor of the quiet, she had unpicked the thread that kept her in his costume. The dress would come off. The new one would be cut from cloth. Nobody in that party.
He fell asleep with the bathroom lights still on and the shower's after steam ghosting the hall. And that was the hour a Benny chose, not for drama, but for room, to stand in the doorway of the small spare room and name it again. Not store closet, not someday, but studio. She lifted the laptop's lid and watched stale dust tilt in the lamplight like confetti left over from a party she hadn't attended, then pressed the power key and felt, in the chime, the tiny lever of a life move. The desktop bloomed with old folders, ember, palm, tide, her color stories like sealed letters from a younger self, and when she opened them, the drawings met her without reproach. Sleeve caps engineered the flatter, hems cut to suggest motion, collars that framed the jaw like understanding. She did not cry. She reached for a notebook, sketched a list that didn't beg. Business registration, domain, storefront, supplier samples, packaging, courier account, and began crossing items before the ink dried. A cheap domain with backbone, an alias that could hold weight, a storefront scaffold that clicked together under her hands with the logic of pattern pieces. She wrote product copy like she was whispering to one person who needed exactly this dress for exactly this day. Tutorials queued, how to calculate landed cost, how to grade sizes for fuller hips without surrendering drape, how to say no to net 60 like a grown company. At 2:07 a.m. she sent her first supplier email, polite, specific, unafraid, requesting MOQ adjustments in exchange for predictable reorders. At 2:41 the reply landed, can. She laughed once quietly and assembled a sample cart like someone laying out instruments before surgery. At 3:22 a soft ping chimed, the first order, small as a sparrow and twice as brave, and she printed a label with hands that shook, then steadied, and then learned the steadiness. By dawn she had built a spreadsheet with columns that told the truth. COGS, fees, shipping, returns, a margin that didn't punish her for existing. She hid the printer beneath a folded throw, slid inventory boxes under the guest bed, and taped a measuring chart inside the wardrobe door behind unused suits. In the morning she tied Moose's tie like a muscle reflex and moved through the apartment's chores as if nothing had left orbit. At lunch she ate standing up and drafted a returns policy kind to customers and firm to chaos. By evening she scheduled posts that showed cloth, craft, fit. No face, not yet, because the work should speak before the world tried to shout over it. Nights stacked like boats of fabric. She learned the patience of couriers, the rudeness of a minority of buyers, the sweetness of the majority, the art of packing a dress so it arrived as promised, not crumple. Her thumbs developed a new rhythm, 2-beat taps for thank yous, long presses for invoices, a practice swipe to archive nonsense. When Musa recorded his podcast in the living room, joking about women playing business, she tidied a silent seam allowance in a bodice and filed the line under fuel. When his friends came by to argue valuations, she muted her notifications and negotiated fabric wastage from 12% to 8%, a victory invisible to men who believed only loud numbers counted. She studied trend reports without letting them drag her off course, built a size chart that respected bodies as they were, and created a quiet ritual. Every 10th order, she paused and wrote a sentence to the woman receiving it, not to send, but to remember the weight of the exchange. May this fit like relief. Weeks turned to months, and the graph grew a modest slope that felt honest, a line that paid for itself and then some. She reinvested until the account balance looked like a conversation with a future rather than a plea to a past. She told no one, not even Madame Tayo yet, because secrecy wasn't shame, it was scaffolding. Inventory came in, went out, came back, taught lessons, went out better. Her alias learned to hold meetings at odd hours with regional buyers who preferred results to resumes. She said we until there truly was a we. One part-time assistant who believed in one tailor who could coax clean joy from a finicky machine. She slept less, but slept deeper, asleep without the dread that had followed her like a draft under a door. The apartment still smelled of Musa's oak moss and applause, but the small room smelled of steam and sizing and newness. And every time she shut his door at sunrise, smoothing her face into the day-wife's calm, she carried a secret not of shame but of authorship, a seam hidden on the inside that kept the whole from falling apart.
She chose a soft day to try an old kindness, packed Musa's favorite jollof in a warm container, tucked grilled chicken, plantain, and a folded note that only said, "Eat," then took a cab across town with the steady hope that maybe they could meet in the middle of so much noise. But the reception met her with lemon cleaner and glass. The secretary's desk squared like a checkpoint. The woman looked up with a reflex smile that stalled when her eyes took in the lunch bag and then, lower, the gentle arc of her own belly beneath a fitted dress. "Hi, I'm here to see Musa," Abeni said, voice courteous. And the secretary, sleek ponytail, manicures like tiny flags, tilted her head as if listening for a sound only she could hear, then smirked with a practiced little shrug. "You're the wife. Wow, he told me you were his sick cousin." The sentence did not shout, but it had excellent aim. It slipped past armor and found its rib. For a heartbeat, Abeni saw two rooms at once, the early apartment where she traded bracelets for rent, and this polished lobby where her marriage was now a story told to strangers with convenient edits. She did not flinch. She adjusted her head tie, nodded once in acknowledgement of the information, not the insult, and placed the lunch bag gently on the desk as if returning a borrowed item that had outlived its purpose. "Please tell him I stopped by," she said, and the secretary's mouth made an almost sorry shape that never reached her eyes. Outside, the city coughed sunlight off car hoods, traffic muttered, a hawker sang prices to no one in particular. Abeni walked to a low wall and sat, tried a forkful of jollof, and discovered she could not taste anything around the heat. She chewed anyway, because her body had earned steadiness, then took out her phone and scrolled to a number Madame Tayo had pressed into her palm months ago, for when you are ready to stop surviving prettily and start moving cleanly, and dialed. "It's time," she told the lawyer, and her voice did not shake. They set an appointment for that afternoon, document checklist already waiting in her inbox before she reached the curb. In the cab home, she inventoried the pieces of her life like a seamstress before a fitting. Registration certificates, bank attestations, career logs, supplier contracts, valuation letter. Everything tabbed and dated. Grief could come later in private. Logistics came now. The apartment opened on its same small sigh, the jacket Musa had left on the couch trying to look expensive and casual at once. She hung it neatly, not in devotion, but because she tidied the world when the world tried to untidy her. In the bedroom, she pulled a slim suitcase from under the bed and packed without theater. Moisturizer, scarf, 2 dresses that traveled well, flats that didn't punish, charger, the pen that never blotted. She took down the box labeled Papers, spread its contents across the table, and sorted with a curator's eye, keep, copy, carry, until the narrative of her last 18 months arranged itself into a spine that could stand upright in any court. She opened a new email to her alias and BCC'd her lawyer on 3 threads: supplier confirmations, regional buyer LOI, brand collab remittance advice, so nothing would depend on memory alone. Then she sat, breathed 4 in, 6 out, and allowed exactly 60 seconds for sorrow. Not for him, his choices were his, but for the girl at 22 who had learned to make her value quiet so someone else could hear his more easily. Time. She stood, locked the studio door behind her, it felt like locking a vault now, and called a ride to the lawyer's office. On the way, a billboard flashed Musa's face above a slogan, "About Grit." She looked at it the way one looks at weather, real, not in charge of her. The meeting room smelled of paper and peppermint tea. The lawyer listened, asked only precise questions, and then said, "We will file the petition and request full consideration of your assets. Your documentation is exemplary." Abeni nodded, slid across the prepared folder with its 12 tabs, and watched a professional pair of eyes do what too many others had refused: take her seriously without needing an origin myth or an apology. By evening, the petition was filed. By nightfall, her calendar was repointed from endurance to execution. She returned home after Musa had left for drinks with a guest. The apartment was polite, impersonal, a hotel playing house. She wrote a short note: "You will be served. Do not contact me outside counsel," then deleted it unsent because she owed him nothing he could twist into spectacle. She showered, braided her hair, and slept at the studio table with her cheek on her folded arms, the hum of the printer a lullaby. In the morning, she rose early and ate the rest of the jollof cold and left the lunch bag on the counter for the cleaner. She wore quiet clothes and a clear face. If anyone had asked, she would have said she was not leaving, she was arriving. The difference was paperwork and a door that finally opened inward.
The discovery session did not look like victory. It looked like fluorescent tubes and files in sober colors, a stenographer tapping without inflection, and chairs that made everyone sit up straight. And that was exactly the terrain Abeni had prepared for. Rooms where noise had no currency and only paper spoke. Musa arrived in curated nonchalance, a navy suit and a grin arranged for cameras that were not allowed inside, whispering to his lawyer with the careless bravado of a man who believed disclosure meant confirming his version of events, not confronting the truth. When the clerk called their matter and Judge Okoye took the bench, the room reset to seriousness, and Musa's counsel began with the smooth cadence of inevitability. No significant marital assets on petitioner's side, your lordship. Respondent's estate remains separate and intact. But the cadence faltered when Abeni's lawyer, voice measured, hands calm, rose and said, "We move to enter 12 exhibits into the record," and slid forward a hardbound file whose tabs shone like quiet metals. Registration and incorporation, trademarks, banking attestations, supply contracts, fulfillment logs, tax returns, regional purchase orders, brand collaborations, investor term sheet, audit letter, valuation report, compliance certificates. The judge's eyebrows made a brief, neutral assent. "Proceed," he said, and the stenographer's keys resumed their metronome. Abeni did not address Musa. She addressed the architecture of the process, dates, signatures, chains of custody. And with each document, the air thickened from story to evidence. A CAC certificate with her full name,
a trademark for ABN Studio stamped clean, bank letters verifying balances across 3 accounts, courier logs showing thousands of parcels moving like heartbeat from her small beginnings to a warehouse sublease, tax filings with figures that looked like grown numbers, not the play pretend of side hustles. "Revenue curve, your lordship," her lawyer said, placing a printout whose slope told a tale of discipline, not virality, but repeatable desirability, followed by a term sheet that documented modest dilution for smart money from a fund whose principals had no interest in podcasts. Musa leaned forward now, sunglasses abandoned on the table, his mouth forming the acronym like an incantation he had once heard and never learned. A, B, N. The judge turned to Abeni. "Miss Ediemi, for clarity, sole proprietor." "Yes, your lordship, sole owner and director. The board resolution is at Exhibit 3. And these returns reflect full declaration." "They do," she answered, and her voice did not tremble, because she knew the ledger better than she knew her own reflection. Musa's lawyer attempted a pivot. Questions about start dates, insinuations about commingling, a theatrical sigh about support. But each suggestion met a receipt. Bank transfers labeled with her alias, forwarding clean salaries from the bank to seed the early months. Supplier emails time-stamped at hours when men who laugh at women's businesses are asleep. An audit letter from a firm with no Instagram, only reputation, attesting that her books were true and fair. The valuation letter came last, not as a flourish, but as a period. $18 million as of last quarter. Methodology attached. Comps listed. Discounts conservative. The word million did not echo. It settled like a table being set for the right guests. Judge Okoye read silently for a long half-minute, then marked 3 deliberate lines on his pad. The court recognizes ABN Studio as petitioner's separate property, legally constituted prior to these proceedings, with revenues and valuations substantiated. And the evenness of his tone, there was a mercy. This was not spectacle. This was fact. The stenographer's hands kept time. A cough traveled the gallery and died. Only then did Musa speak, not to the judge, but to her, a whisper heavy as confession. "It's yours?" She turned her head, and he found no rage there, no triumph, only an ease he no longer had a map for. "It always was," she said, and returned her gaze to the bench. Her lawyer requested that all references to dead weight and phase in respondents' public statements be noted, not for damages, but to clarify the record of contempt against contribution. And Judge Okoye, unimpressed by theater, nodded once. Noted. Musa's counsel tried for one last scrap. "Surely, your lordship, respondent's guidance." But the judge cut in, polite and final. "Counsel, guidance is not ownership. The documents are clear." The session ended the way dawn ends, without applause, with light simply replacing dark. In the corridor, as counsel discussed timelines and the clerk stamped copies, Musa stood like a man late to his own understanding, while Abeni slipped the bound set into her bag with the gentleness one reserves for instruments and heirlooms. She did not quicken her pace. She did not look back to see if he watched her. She walked into a day that did not require permission, the door swinging shut behind her with a soft sound that felt, to both of them, like a verdict delivered and a life correctly titled.
She learned that endings invite inventory, and so when counsel explaining what she could legally demand, the house with its expensive echo, the cars that photographed well, the furniture that bruised shins in the dark, Abani did a different arithmetic, one that valued breath over bragging rights. She let the artifacts of performance remain where performance lived, and chose the assets that couldn't be posted: her signatures, her quiet, her compass. "We can press harder," her lawyer said, professional, not pushy, and Abani shook her head with gratitude because she had no interest in winning a museum of someone else's taste. The house remembered too many apologies that spoiled by morning, the car remembered too many phone calls taken in speaker mode, and the watches remembered every time he was late to tenderness. She returned keys in a small envelope and kept copies of the only keys that mattered: studio, warehouse sublease, post office box, and moved into an apartment with honest light and stubborn windows, a place where her name alone unlocked the door. The first night there the power blinked, and she laughed in the dark because she knew where her candles were, and because nothing in the room belonged to an audience. In the days that followed, she practiced the muscle of refusal without resentment. No to a TV segment that wanted tears more than truth. No to a tell-all thread. No to the friend of a friend who offered brand synergy for a percentage that tried to rename theft. Yes to the small things that stitch a life. Running at dawn along quiet streets, frying eggs in a pan that didn't stick, buying a plant that would not scold her if it died. She hired the part-time assistant full-time, converted the tailor's contract to salaried with health coverage that made the woman cry in the fitting room, and gave both of them Monday mornings with no meetings, so craft could keep its word. In the warehouse, rails of garments breathed like orderly forests, and she walked between them, touching sleeves with a gratitude that did not beg to be witnessed. Some days she stood at the loading bay and watched boxes leave in the backs of vans and thought of the first order she had printed at 3:22 a.m., how her hands had shaken then, how they didn't now. She built a sturdier returns process, paid for software that reduced fraud without punishing honesty, and wrote a size inclusivity note at the top of the website in a voice that sounded like a promise kept. On Wednesdays, she mentored a cohort at the Women in Business Hub, not with slogans, but with inventory math and vendor scripts. Say, "We can commit to 300 if you can commit to 10-day lead time and hold your silence after the ask." And the room learned to love the quiet between sentence and concession. She also learned to give herself clean endings. She didn't draft messages she wouldn't send, didn't stalk the app that tracked his podcast charts, didn't replay scenes that had already been edited by truth. When people asked about the divorce, she said, "We ended well on paper," and left the rest to rumor's short attention span. Shipments hiccuped in rainy season, and she solved it with better poly, better tape, and a warehouse fan that sounded like determination. Sometimes, late, she'd open the magazine with her face on the cover, still odd, still out of scale with how she felt inside, and then close it because she preferred the spreadsheet that told a quieter, truer story. Units sold, salaries paid, returns falling, a cash cushion that let her sleep. She kept one indulgence, fabric she didn't need yet, bought because it made her think in color, and stacked it on a shelf she labeled "Someday." On a Thursday, a courier handed her an envelope with the court seal, and the final decree lay inside like a well-pressed suit. Paragraphs about dissolution and property and peaceable conduct. She read it at the kitchen counter, signed where she needed to sign, and slid it into the drawer beside her passport. Afterward, she stood at the window while evening braided traffic below, and she whispered a small thank you for the girl who had traded bracelets to keep rent paid, and for the woman who now bought bracelets because she liked the way they sounded when she typed. Later, an invitation arrived from a regional fashion week, 2 shows, 1 talk, and she accepted the shows and declined the talk because the dresses could say what the microphone would mangle. The night before her team stitched the last hems for the runway, a message came from an unknown number. "Proud of you. I'm sorry." Musa, finally finding the right words when they no longer had a job. She deleted nothing, replied nothing, archived everything under a mental folder named Clear.
She slept early, woke before her alarm, and walked to the studio in air that remembered rain. The collection waited on mannequins with pins in their mouths, as if the garments were keeping a secret for her. She adjusted a shoulder seam, smoothed a lining, and felt not triumph, not revenge, but fit, the sensation of a life finally tailored to measure. She had not taken his house, or his car, or his watches. She had taken the only thing that could not be repossessed, the authority to decide how the next scene would feel when she entered it.
6 months later, the city wore a softer light, as if the weather itself had decided to stop performing. And in a reception area dressed in neutral plants and patient clocks, Musa sat pretending not to be kept waiting until a magazine cover arrested his thumb mid-flip. A beanie, standing in fabric that braided lineage with intention, gaze level as a ledger, The Silent Storm, ABN Studios Rise, and beneath the headline, subheads that did not need exclamation marks: multi-country rollout, Paris showcase, mentorship pipeline, valuation reiterated by independent auditors, a photograph of the studio team laughing around a cutting table where order and joy shared elbows. He read the feature twice, then a third time, searching for a footnote that would shrink it to something survivable. There wasn't one. Across town, in a hotel suite with a view that turned traffic into a hush of light, Abini zipped her suitcase without hurry, checked that the garment bags were tagged in both languages, and listened as her assistant, Kemi, read out the day. Rehearsal slot moved up by 30 minutes. Model 19 requested a different shoe. The Women in Business Hub had already filled the mentorship cohort's next intake after last night's talk. Clips of her refusing the word empire in favor of ecosystem were making a quiet tour online. Confirmation from Paris? Abini asked, and Kemi lifted her phone. Yes to the backstage passes, yes to the buyer breakfast, no to the panel titled Female Founders Break the Bias, because the dresses would say it cleaner, and because Abini had learned the hard way that some panels invite you to explain your humanity for free while the men got on with sales. She smiled, thanked Kemi, and sent a voice note to the warehouse. Good luck to Dorian on your driving test. Please use the sturdier tape on the northern routes. Remember to hydrate because heat is a thief. And then she sat for a minute with the window, not for drama, but for calibration, watching the city breathe in rectangles. Her phone pinged, a text from Madame Tayo, all punctuation and blessing. Proud of you. Keep your peace expensive. And a second from an unknown number that she didn't need to open to understand. She archived it to the folder in her mind, labeled Clear, and stood. Downstairs, the elevator offered her back to herself in its mirror, a woman dressed in quiet precision, no apologies stitched into any seam. In the car to the airport, she answered 3 emails with decisions that would make 5 people's days easier. She turned down an interview that wanted the word resilience on loop and accepted a request from a small school that needed fabric offcuts for an art project. Balance, she had learned, was not a scale, but a rhythm. On the plane, she slept, the kind of sleep that trusts tomorrow because it can read the calendar and see her name written in her own hand. Paris greeted her with cold that made the garments crisp to the eye. Backstage smelled like steam, hairspray, and ambition. Her team moved like a sentence that knew where its verb lived. She tweaked 2 belts, released 1 hem, and nodded at Model 19's shoes. When the lights finally spilled and the first look turned the corner, the room's inhale felt familiar, the precise silence that happens when a thing lands exactly where it was meant to. Cameras did their weather, buyers did their calculation. Somewhere in the back, a young designer wiped her eyes because she had never seen her body centered without apology. After the show came the stiller work, handshakes that would become terms, terms that would become salaries, salaries that would become choices for people whose lives deserved fewer emergency edges. At midnight, in a rented apartment with a stubborn radiator, Abini boiled water for tea and opened the magazine Kemi had tucked into her carry-on. The article's last paragraph quoted her from a question she barely remembered answering. What did you prove? Nothing. I don't live to prove. I live to build, to mentor, to rest, to love my work without asking it to love me back. She smiled because it still fit, and because proof, she knew, was a performance best left to people who hadn't met the pleasure of competence. She sent one message to the mentorship cohort: measure twice, cut once. Cut once, move forward. Moving forward is the point. And another to Kemi: sleep. Tomorrow we celebrate with waffles. Across the continent, a man in a reception area finally heard his name called and stood up a little slower, altered by a story in which he was no longer the main verb. In the thin morning between Paris and Lagos, Abini set her alarm, breathed 4 in and 6 out, and felt the room answer with its own steady tempo. The compass that had once spun under someone else's weather lay quiet and true now, face up on her nightstand. She did not touch it. She didn't need to.